Changing exposure modes, PASM, in your Fujifilm X-T50 isn't quite as straightforward as traditional DSLRs that have a PASM dial, where you can just rotate it to switch between aperture priority and manual exposure mode. And I've been getting some questions about that recently, so we're going to look at that in this video. And while it is specific to the X-T50, it can really be applied to most other Fujifilm cameras too, like the X-T, X-E, X-Pro, X100 series cameras, so long as you know how to change both your aperture and your shutter speed. And if you want to dive deeper into these exposure modes and all other aspects of your Fujifilm X-T50, you can do that in the X-T50 tutorial course found at photocourses.link/X-T50. Use TUBE20 coupon code to get 20% off of that course. So here's just the basics on changing those exposure modes. And the first thing you need to do is flip this little lever that's attached to your shutter speed dial out of the auto position. If that's in auto, you're not going to be able to control anything in your camera. So you need to set it to that little dot. The first mode is Program Auto Mode, P, where the camera is in automatic control of both the aperture and the shutter speed. So since the camera is in automatic control, you set the shutter speed dial to A for auto and your aperture control ring to A for auto. Or if your lens has a switch, set it to A. If your lens has neither of those things, you'll need to press and release the front command dial under the shutter button until you see F highlighted in your display, and then rotate that command dial so the numbers get bigger, and they're in blue, and as they get bigger, they'll finally switch to white, and you'll see some other aperture there. Then you should see P in the lower left corner of the display to let you know that you are in Program Auto Mode, and the camera is in control of both the aperture and the shutter speed. To get into aperture priority mode, where you have direct manual control over the aperture while the camera is in automatic control of the shutter speed, you keep the shutter speed dial set to the A position and then manually set the aperture to whatever aperture you want. You may have to flip that switch into the aperture symbol to be able to move that ring for direct aperture control, or if you don't have an aperture ring, again, press and release the front command dial until you see F displayed, and then rotate that dial until you have a blue F number. And that means that you are in direct control of setting the aperture. And you should see A in the lower left corner to let you know you're in aperture priority mode. Shutter priority mode, S, where you are in direct control of the shutter speed while the camera has automatic control over the aperture. Hopefully you're seeing a trend here. You want to set that aperture to auto, like we did for the Program Auto Mode, and then set your shutter speed dial to the shutter speed that you want manual control over. And if you set it to T, you can use the rear command dial to get a wider range of shutter speeds. Anytime you see a semicircle in the bottom of the screen for those exposure variables with the standard display, those semicircles correspond to either the front command dial or the rear command dial to change those variables. But once you set the aperture to A and the shutter speed to something manual, then you'll see S in the lower left corner of the screen for shutter priority. And then manual exposure mode, where you are in direct control of both the aperture and the shutter speed, you just set a manual aperture and a manual shutter speed, and you'll see, you guessed it, M in the lower left corner of the display. Now in any of these four modes, you can use either a manual ISO or an auto ISO. If you're in an auto ISO program, you'll see that in the lower right, A, 1, 2, or 3, and then a number. That number does confuse a lot of people. That doesn't mean that's the ISO that you're going to have right now for that photo. That's just your maximum ISO for that auto ISO program. Once you press the shutter button halfway to lock in that exposure, then you'll see the ISO that the camera is going to use for that photo. So that's the basics of switching between the PASM exposure modes and the Fujifilm X-T50 and most other Fujifilm cameras. It really is quite intuitive once you think about which variable you're in control of and which variable the camera is in control of. And again, you can check out the Fujifilm X-T50 tutorial course at photocourses.link to learn more about when and how to use these exposure modes and everything else about your X-T50. If you have any other questions about this, please leave them in the comments. Subscribe for more great tips like this every week, and we'll see you in the next video.